Active Directory. Explain the group scopes in Windows 2003 AD. Group scope. Any group, whether it is a security group or a distribution group, is characterized by a scope that identifies the extent to which the group is applied in the domain tree or forest. The boundary, or reach, of a group scope is also determined by the domain functional level setting of the domain in which it resides. There are three group scopes: universal, global, and domain local. The following table describes the differences between the scopes of each group. Group scope. Group can include as members. Group can be assigned permissions in. Group scope can be converted to. Universal accounts from any domain within the forest in which this universal group resides. Global groups from any domain within the forest in which this universal group resides. Universal groups from any domain within the forest in which this universal group resides. Any domain or forest. Domain local. Global, as long as no other universal groups exist as members. Global accounts from the same domain as the parent global group. Global groups from the same domain as the parent global group. Member permissions can be assigned in any domain universal, as long as it is not a member of any other global groups. Domain local accounts from any domain. Global groups from any domain. Universal groups from any domain. Domain local groups but only from the same domain as the parent domain local group. Member permissions can be assigned only within the same domain as the parent domain local group. Universal, as long as no other domain local groups exist as members. Explain the types of ad groups that can created in Windows 2003 AD. Group types. Groups are used to collect user accounts, computer accounts, and other group accounts into manageable units. Working with groups instead of with individual users helps simplify network maintenance and administration. There are two types of groups in Active Directory: distribution groups and security groups. You can use distribution groups to create email distribution lists and security groups to assign permissions to shared resources. Distributions groups. Distribution groups can be used only with email applications, such as Exchange, to send email to collections of users. Distribution groups are not security-enabled, which means that they cannot be listed in discretionary access control lists, DACLs. If you need a group for controlling access to shared resources, create a security group. Security groups, used with care. Security groups provide an efficient way to assign access to resources on your network. Using security groups, you can assign user rights to security groups in Active Directory and assign permissions to security groups on resources. I am trying to create a new universal user group. Why can't I? Universal groups are allowed only in native mode Windows Server 2003 environments. Native mode requires that all domain controllers be promoted to Windows Server 2003 Active Directory. What is a creator-owner account in Windows? Creator-owner includes the user account for a user who created or took ownership of a resource. If a member of the administrators group creates a resource, the administrators group is the owner of the resource. This group is created for each shareable resource on Windows 2000 Server or Professional. A placeholder in an inheritable access control entry, ACE. When the ACE is inherited, the system replaces this SID with the SID for the object's creator. What is the difference between enterprise admins and domain admins account in Active Directory? Domain admins group is only available on Windows 2000-2003 servers acting as domain controllers. Its members are allowed administrative privileges for the entire domain. By default, this group has the local administrator account on the domain controller as its member. Enterprise admins group exists only in the root domain of an Active Directory forest of domains. It is a universal group if the domain is in native mode, a global group if the domain is in mixed mode. The group is authorized to make forest-wide changes in Active Directory, such as adding child domains. By default, the only member of the group is the administrator account for the forest root domain. This group is automatically added to the administrators group in every domain in the forest, providing complete access to the configuration of all domain controllers. This group can modify the membership of all administrative groups. Its own membership can be modified only by the default service administrator groups in the root domain. This account is considered a service administrator. What are the differences between group policy, registry-based policy, and security policy? Group policy is an infrastructure in which IT administrators can implement standard computing environments for groups of users and computers and includes both registry-based and security policy. Registry-based policy is one of the many features of group policy that uses administrative templates to modify the registry settings for policy-enabled components included in Windows. Security policy, another feature delivered by group policy, includes a variety of security-related settings for Microsoft Windows. Is there a maximum number of group policy objects that I can store in a domain? Creating a group policy object will create a group policy container object, stored in Active Directory, and a group policy template, stored on the Sysbolt of the domain controller. Both are limited only to the amount of free disk space. What is the maximum number of group policy objects a user or computer can process? A user or computer cannot process more than 999 group policy objects. Windows Vista writes a Windows group policy error event with an event ID of 1088 to the system event log when a user or computer attempts to process more than 999 group policy objects. Can I apply a group policy object directly to a security group? You cannot apply a group policy object directly to a security group. However, you can use security filtering to refine which users or computers will receive and apply group policy settings. The Group Policy Management Console, GPMC, is the tool to manage security filtering. For more information about security filtering, see the Core Group Policy Technical Reference. Explain GPMC and RSOP in Windows 2003. GPMC is a tool which will be used for managing group policies and will display information like how many policies applied, on which OUs the policies applied, what are the settings enabled in each policy, who are the users affected by these policies, who is managing these policies. GPMC will display all the above information. RSOP provides details about all policy settings that are configured by an administrator, including administrative templates, folder redirection, Internet Explorer maintenance, security settings, scripts, and group policy software installation. When policies are applied on multiple levels, for example, site, domain, domain controller, and organizational unit, the results can conflict. RSOP can help you determine a set of applied policies and their precedence, the order in which policies are applied. What is the difference between assign and publish application through GPO? Software installation, SI, policy is designed to allow you to deploy, assign, publish, Windows installer packages, .msi files, to users and computers within an ad domain. SI policy supports two types of installation methods. Publishing. Publishing is only available per user and provides you with a way of publishing applications to the ad, remove programs control panel. Users can then optional install an application from there. Assignment. Assignment is available per user or per computer. Per computer assignment lets you deploy an application to a computer. That application is automatically installed at the next computer restart. Per user assignment lets you deploy an application at user logon. If you choose the Install on First Use option, available in Win2K and Win2K3/XP, then the full application is not installed, but rather only shortcuts and file extensions that are registered by that application. When the user clicks on one of these registered entry points, the application is installed at that time, hence the term Install on First Use. In Win2K3 and XP, you have the option of installing the full application at user logon time, which takes longer but ensures that the application is fully ready when the user's desktop appears. Explain the loopback processing feature of group policy. Loopback processing is a feature that allows a more precise level of control over user policy settings for a targeted machine. Usually, user policy settings are derived entirely from the GPOs associated with the user account, based on its location in the Active Directory. With loopback processing, however, the user policy settings in the GPOs associated with the machine are applied. A common use of loopback is on terminal services machines. In this scenario, it is common for the group policy administrator to set specific user policy settings for the server to ensure that all users using the machine receive a defined set of user policy settings. 2 modes options when applying loopback processing. Replace mode. The user policy is defined entirely from the GPOs associated with the machine. Any GPOs associated with the user are ignored. Merge mode. The user policy settings applied are the combination of those included in both the machine and user GPOs. Where conflicts exist, the machine GPOs win. Loopback setting technical details. In order to define the loopback processing setting, the following steps should be followed. 1. Open the Group Policy Object Editor, .msc. See Create, Edit GPOs for details. 2. Expand the Computer Configuration node. Under Computer Configuration, expand the Administrative Templates node. 3. Within the Administrative Templates node, expand the System node, and then the Group Policy node. 4. Locate the setting User Group Policy Loopback Processing Mode. Double-click this setting, and define the setting as needed. When the loopback setting is enabled on a machine, either via local policy or domain policy, the behavior of group policy application changes in one of 2 ways, depending on the selected mode. It should be noted that while the setting affects the behavior of application of user policies, the setting itself is applied to the machine the user logs onto. What permissions are necessary for group policy to apply to a user or computer? Group policy can apply to any user or computer with access control entry for read and apply group policy. Where a group policy is stored. %system root %system32 /group policy. Where is GPT stored? %system root %\sysbolt /sysbolt /domain name /policies /gid. What's contained in Administrative Template Conference? ADM. Microsoft Net Meeting Policies. Explain the enforce and block inheritance features available when managing GPO precedents. Enforced, this was previously referred to in Win2K as no override. The enforced flag is set on a GPO link using the GPMC. Essentially what it does is say, if there are any conflicting policy settings on downstream GPOs processed after the enforced GPO, those settings will always be overridden. Essentially how this works is that any GPO links that are marked as enforced, will be moved to the bottom of the group policy processing list. This ensures that the enforced policy is always processed last, and thus wins over any downstream GPOs. Enforced GPOs will override block inheritance, described next. Block inheritance. The block inheritance flag is set on a container object, specifically either an OU or a domain. The purpose of block inheritance is to block upstream GPOs from being processed, except for GPOs set with the enforced flag. For example, if I have 2 OUs marketing and East is a child OU to marketing, I can set the block inheritance flag on the East OU and any GPOs linked to marketing will be blocked and won't apply to users and computers in the East OU. What is the significance of Sysbolt directory and add? The Windows Server 2003 system volume, Sysbolt, is a shared directory that stores the server copy of the domain's public files, which are replicated among all domain controllers in the domain. Sysbolt is a collection of folders and reparse points in the file systems that exist on each domain controller in a domain. Sysbolt provides a standard location to store important elements of group policy objects, GPOs, and scripts so that the file replication service, FRS, can distribute them to other domain controllers within that domain. List out the important ports used in AD communications. 88, Kerberos. 135, Remote Procedure Call, RPC, Endpoint Mapper. 53, Domain Name System, DNS. 137, NetBIOS Name Server. 139, NetBIOS Session Service. 389, LDAP Query. 445, Server Message Blocks, SMBs. 636, Secure LDAP, LDAP over SSL. 3268, GC LDAP. 3269, Secure GC, LDAP over SSL. What is a site? Site is a location on the physical network that contains ad servers. A site is defined as one or more well-connected transmission control protocol, Internet Protocol, TCP/IP, subnets. Differentiate between intra-site replication can be done between the domain controllers in the same site. Inter-site replication can be done between two different sites over WAN links. BHS, bridgehead servers, is responsible for initiating replication between the sites. Inter-site replication can be done BHS in one site and BHS in another site. What are lingering objects in AD? A lingering object is an object that is present on one replica, but on another replica it has been deleted and removed from the directory by the garbage collection process. This condition can occur for a variety of reasons including prolonged misconfigurations, such as those that cause event ID 1311 messages. Prolonged errors in name resolution, authentication or the replication engine that block inbound replication. Bringing a domain controller online after it has been offline for a period greater than the tombstone lifetime, TSL. Advancing system time or reducing TSL values in an attempt to accelerate garbage collection before end-to-end replication has taken place for all naming contexts in the forest. Symptoms that you may have lingering objects. Active Directory replication is prevented from occurring. A user account that no longer exists still appears in the global address list for email clients. A universal group that no longer exists still appears in a user's access token. Email messages cannot be delivered due to duplicate email address on two different user objects. Regardless of the reason, a deleted object can remain on a domain controller in either of the following circumstances. A domain controller goes offline immediately prior to the deletion of an object on another domain controller, and remains offline for a period that exceeds the tombstone lifetime. A domain controller goes offline immediately following the deletion of an object on another domain controller but prior to receiving replication of the tombstone, and remains offline for a period that exceeds the tombstone lifetime. What to do with a lingering object? Determining what to do with a lingering object depends on whether or not it was intended. Action explanation. Unintended use repadmin to delete the lingering object on a domain controller that is running Windows Server 2003. Intended change the replication consistency on the inbound domain controller, DC. The object will be reanimated on this DC. See strict and loose replication consistency below. Strict and loose replication consistency. If the attributes of a lingering object never change, the object is never considered for replication. However, if an attribute changes, the attribute is considered for outbound replication. The problem with an attribute update for a lingering object is that the receiving domain controller does not hold the object for the attribute being replicated. An update cannot be performed because the entire object does not exist on the receiving domain controller. What happens next depends on the replication consistency set on the domain controller. Replication consistency explanation. Loose. When replication consistency is set to loose, the receiving domain controller detects that it does not have the object for the attribute that is being replicated. The inbound partner requests the entire object from the outbound partner, and reanimates the object on its copy of the directory. The same process repeats on all domain controllers that do not have a copy of the object. This mechanism can be used to cause lingering objects to reanimate across the entire forest. If a lingering object is discovered and its presence is intended, then perform any update to the object. As long as replication consistency is set to loose on all domain controllers, the object will be reanimated as it replicates around the forest. Loose replication consistency is the default for Windows 2000 domain controllers, with the exception of domain controllers that have the MS-01044 security rollup package installed. For more information about the MS-01044 security rollup package, see Article 297,860 in the Microsoft Knowledge Base, go.microsoft.com web link. Strict the default behavior for domain controllers that run Windows Server 2003, and domain controllers that are upgraded from Windows NT 4.0, is to block inbound replication for each naming context when a domain controller receives an update to an object that it does not have. Replication is halted in the naming context for the object until the lingering object is removed or the replication mode is set to loose. Storage for consistency setting. The setting for replication consistency is in the registry on each domain controller. /local_machine/system/current control set/services/ntds/parameters. Entry name, strict replication consistency. Data type, reg_.erd. Values, 1 for enabled, 0 for disabled. Default, 1, enabled. Note: there was a post-SP2 hotfix, also included in the security roll-up package from November 2001, that used a different registry value. A setting of 0 will not recreate the missing object, strict, and a setting of 1 will create the missing object. This value is only needed with the November version of the hotfix. Value name, correct missing objects. Data type, reg_.erd. Value data, 1. The repadmin/removal lingering objects command does the following. Designates an up-to-date domain controller as the authority. Compares the Active Directory database objects on the authoritative server with the objects that are on the suspected domain controller that contains the lingering objects. With /advisory_mode, the subcommand logs the potential deletions to the directory service log. Without /advisory_mode, the subcommand removes the lingering objects. Syntax. Repadmin/removal lingering objects test_dc_list source dc kidnk /advisory_mode. Parameter description. dest_dc_list the domain controller that is suspected to have lingering objects. Source dc gid source domain controller gid used to compare with the suspected domain controller. NC specifies the distinguished name of the directory partition. /advisory_mode read-only mode. Note: during lingering object removal, event ID 1937 is logged to the directory service log. This information includes the source domain controller, the objects that are removed, and a total count of all the objects that are removed. What is USN with reference to Active Directory? Update sequence numbers, USNs. A USN is a 64-bit counter that is associated with each object. It increments each time a change is initiated, and then it's associated with the change. To view the USN of an object, use the following command at a command prompt. repadmin/showmtibjackdn. What is KCC? The KCC is a built-in process that runs on all domain controllers. The KCC generates and maintains the replication topology for replication within sites and between sites. The KCC has two major functions. Configures replication connections, connection objects, between domain controllers. Each connection object defines incoming replication from a replication partner. Within a site, each KCC generates its own connections. For replication between sites, a single KCC per site generates all connections between sites. Converts the connection objects that represent inbound replication to the local domain controller into the replication agreements that are actually used by the replication engine. By default, the KCC reviews and makes modifications to the Active Directory replication topology every 15 minutes to ensure propagation of data, either directly or transitively, by creating and deleting connection objects as needed. The KCC recognizes changes that occur in the environment and ensures that domain controllers are not orphaned in the replication topology. What are the protocols used by Active Directory for replication? Active Directory uses Remote Procedure Call (RPC) over Internet Protocol (IP) to transfer replication data between domain controllers. RPC over IP is used for both inter-site and intra-site replication. To keep data secure while in transit, RPC over IP replication uses both authentication, using the Kerberos v5 authentication protocol, and data encryption. When a direct or reliable IP connection is not available, replication between sites can be configured to use the Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, SMTP. However, SMTP replication functionality is limited, and requires an Enterprise Certification Authority, CA. SMTP can only be used to replicate the configuration, schema and application directory partitions, and does not support the replication of domain directory partitions. Explain the Active Directory partitions. In Active Directory, a directory partition is a portion of the directory namespace. Each directory partition contains a hierarchy, a subtree, of directory objects in the directory tree. The same directory partition can be stored as copies, replicas, on many domain controllers, and the copies are updated through directory replication. Every domain controller contains the following 3 directory partitions. Configuration contains the configuration container, which stores configuration objects for the entire forest, and CN equals configuration, DC equals forest root domain. Updates to this container are replicated to all domain controllers in the forest. Configuration objects store information about sites, services, and directory partitions. You can view the contents of the configuration container by using ADC-Edit. Schema contains the schema container, which stores class and attribute definitions for all existing and possible Active Directory objects in CN equals schema, CN equals configuration, DC equals forest root domain. Updates to this container are replicated to all domain controllers in the forest. You can view the contents of the schema container in the Active Directory schema console. Domain contains a domain container, for example, the reskit.com container, which stores users, computers, groups, and other objects for a specific Windows 2000 domain, for example, the reskit.com domain. Updates to the domain container are replicated to only domain controllers within the domain and to global catalog servers if the update is made to an attribute that is marked for replication to the global catalog. The domain container is displayed in the Active Directory Users and Computers console. The hierarchy of domain directory partitions can be viewed in the Active Directory Domains and Trusts console, where trust relationships between domains can be managed. Application partition. Windows 2003 AD comes with a new partition called Application Partition. An application directory partition is a directory partition that is replicated only to specific domain controllers. A domain controller that participates in the replication of a particular application directory partition hosts a replica of that partition. Only domain controllers running Windows Server 2003 can host a replica of an application directory partition. What is the name of a database and what is the default location of a database? ntds.dit, the main database file. ntds.dit grows as the database fills with objects and attributes. However, the log files have a fixed size of 10 megabytes, MB. Any changes made to the database are also made to the current log file and to the DIT file in the cache. Eventually the cache is flushed. If a computer failure occurs before the cache is flushed, it uses the log file to complete the update to the DIT file. By default, the add database is stored in drive /win/ntds/ntds.dit. The log files for the directory database are stored in the same directory by default. Their purpose is to track the changes in the directory database, and they can grow to be quite large. Give all the room you can to the log files. For example, you can place the log files on different disk drives than the database file to reduce disk contention on a single drive. EDB. Log.log, EDB. Log is the current log file for add. When a change is made to the database, it's written to this file. When EDB log becomes full of database transactions, it's renamed to add.log, where XXXXX starts at 0001 and continues to increment using hexadecimal notation. Add uses circular logging, which constantly deletes old log files. If you view the directory files at any time, you'll notice the EDB log file and at least one or more add.log files. EDB CHK stores the database checkpoint, which identifies the point at which the database engine needs to replay the logs. This file is typically used during recovery and initialization. res1.log and res2.log, placeholders designed to reserve the last 20 megabytes of disk space on the disk drive. Saving disk space gives the log files sufficient room to shut down gracefully if other disk space is consumed. What are FSMO roles in brief them all? Windows 2000-2003 Multi-Master Model. A multi-master-enabled database, such as the Active Directory, provides the flexibility of allowing changes to occur at any DC in the enterprise, but it also introduces the possibility of conflicts that can potentially lead to problems once the data is replicated to the rest of the enterprise. One way Windows 2000-2003 deals with conflicting updates is by having a conflict resolution algorithm handle discrepancies in values by resolving to the DC to which changes were written last, that is, the last writer wins, while discarding the changes in all other DCs. Although this resolution method may be acceptable in some cases, there are times when conflicts are just too difficult to resolve using the last writer wins approach. In such cases, it is best to prevent the conflict from occurring rather than to try to resolve it after the fact. For certain types of changes, Windows 2000-2003 incorporates methods to prevent conflicting Active Directory updates from occurring. Windows 2000-2003 Single Master Model. To prevent conflicting updates in Windows 2000-2003, the Active Directory performs updates to certain objects in a single master fashion. In a single master model, only one DC in the entire directory is allowed to process updates. This is similar to the role given to a primary domain controller, PDC, in earlier versions of Windows, such as Microsoft Windows NT 4.0. in which the PDC is responsible for processing all updates in a given domain. In a forest, there are 5 FSMO roles that are assigned to one or more domain controllers. The 5 FSMO roles are: Flexible Single Master Operation, FSMO, roles are Domain Naming Master, Schema Master, PDC Emulator, Infrastructure Master, Read Master, Schema Master. The Schema Master domain controller controls all updates and modifications to the schema. Once the schema update is complete, it is replicated from the Schema Master to all other DCs in the directory. To update the schema of a forest, you must have access to the Schema Master. There can be only one Schema Master in the whole forest. Domain Naming Master. The Domain Naming Master domain controller controls the addition or removal of domains in the forest. This DC is the only one that can add or remove a domain from the directory. It can also add or remove cross-references to domains in external directories. There can be only one Domain Naming Master in the whole forest. Infrastructure Master. When an object in one domain is referenced by another object in another domain, it represents the reference by the GID, the SID, for references to security principles, and the DN of the object being referenced. The infrastructure FSMO role holder is the DC responsible for updating an object's SID and distinguished name in a cross-domain object reference. At any one time, There can be only one domain controller acting as the infrastructure master in each domain. Note, the infrastructure master (IM) role should be held by a domain controller that is not a global catalog server (GC). If the infrastructure master runs on a global catalog server, it will stop updating object information because it does not contain any references to objects that it does not hold. This is because a global catalog server holds a partial replica of every object in the forest. As a result, cross-domain object references in that domain will not be updated, and a warning to that effect will be logged on that DC's event log. If all the domain controllers in a domain also host the global catalog, all the domain controllers have the current data, and it is not important which domain controller holds the infrastructure master role. Relative ID, or RID, master. The RID master is responsible for processing RID pool requests from all domain controllers in a particular domain. When a DC creates a security principal object such as a user or group, it attaches a unique security ID, SID, to the object. This SID consists of a domain SID, the same for all SIDs created in a domain, and a relative ID, or RID, that is unique for each security principal SID created in a domain. Each DC in a domain is allocated a pool of RIDs that it is allowed to assign to the security principals it creates. When a DC's allocated RID pool falls below a threshold, that DC issues a request for additional RIDs to the domain's RID master. The domain RID master responds to the request by retrieving RIDs from the domain's unallocated RID pool and assigns them to the pool of the requesting DC. At any one time, there can be only one domain controller acting as the RID master in the domain. PDC emulator. The PDC emulator is necessary to synchronize time in an enterprise. Windows 2000-2003 includes the W32 time, Windows time service that is required by the Kerberos authentication protocol. All Windows 2000-2003 based computers within an enterprise use a common time. The purpose of the time service is to ensure that the Windows time service uses a hierarchical relationship that controls authority and does not permit loops to ensure appropriate common time usage. The PDC emulator of a domain is authoritative for the domain. The PDC emulator at the root of the forest becomes authoritative for the enterprise, and should be configured to gather the time from an external source. All PDC FSMO role holders follow the hierarchy of domains and the selection of their inbound time partner. In a Windows 2000-2003 domain, the PDC emulator role holder retains the following functions. Password changes performed by other DCs in the domain are replicated preferentially to the PDC emulator. Authentication failures that occur at a given DC in a domain because of an incorrect password are forwarded to the PDC emulator before a bad password failure message is reported to the user. Account lockout is processed on the PDC emulator. Editing or creation of group policy objects, GPO, is always done from the GPO copy found in the PDC emulator's Sysbolt share, unless configured not to do so by the administrator. The PDC emulator performs all of the functionality that a Microsoft Windows NT 4.0 server-based PDC or earlier PDC performs for Windows NT 4.0 based or earlier clients. This part of the PDC emulator role becomes unnecessary when all workstations, member servers, and domain controllers that are running Windows NT 4.0 or earlier are all upgraded to Windows 2000-2003. The PDC emulator still performs the other functions as described in a Windows 2000-2003 environment. At any one time, there can be only one domain controller acting as the PDC emulator master in each domain in the forest. What is a global catalog? Global catalog contains index of all objects in the forest and a small, most commonly used, subset, about 60 out of 1,500, of their attributes. This eliminates most of the time the need for requesters searches through other domains in a forest, unless one of non-typical attributes is searched for. The number of attributes stored on each global catalog server can be modified by using schema management snap-in. by selecting Replicate this attribute to the Global Catalog option for selected attributes of an object. What is Universal Group Membership Cache in Windows 2003? Universal Group Membership Caching prevents the need to locate a global catalog across a wide area network, WAN, when logging on by storing Universal Group Membership information on an authenticating domain controller. Information is stored locally once this option is enabled and the user attempts to log on for the first time. The domain controller obtains the Universal Group Membership for that user from the global catalog. Once the Universal Group Membership information is obtained, it is cached on the domain controller for that site indefinitely and is periodically refreshed. The next time that user attempts to log on, the authenticating domain controller running Windows Server 2003 will obtain the Universal Group Membership information from its local cache without the need to contact a global catalog. By default, the Universal Group Membership information contained in the cache of each domain controller will be refreshed every 8 hours. Can I place Global Catalog and Infrastructure Master role on the same server? Justify your answer. Global Catalog should not be placed on the same server as Infrastructure Master. The role of Infrastructure Master is to update references from objects in its own domain to objects in other domains. This is done by comparing its data with that of a global catalog. If the Infrastructure Master finds out that its data is outdated, it requests the update from the global catalog and then sends the updates to other domain controllers in the domain. If they happen to be the same server, the Infrastructure Master would never be able to find that the data is out of date and update other domain controllers in the domain. However, it is recommended to place the Infrastructure Master in the same site as a global catalog server. Give the names of few standard commands/tools from MS to troubleshoot ad-related issues. Lookup/DNSCMD to troubleshoot DNS-related issues with reference to ad. XASTAT utility compare directory information on domain controllers or directory partitions detects and examines the differences among a user-defined scope of objects on two domain controllers. It retrieves capacity statistics such as megabytes per server, objects per server, and megabytes per object class. XASTAT determines whether domain controllers in a domain have a consistent and accurate image of their own domain. DAG, the Domain Controller Diagnostic DAG, utility allows you to analyze the current state of the domain controllers in a domain or forest. It automatically performs the analysis and reports any problems with the domain controller. DAG consists of a set of tests that you can use to verify and report on the functional components of AD on the computer. Untitled, the Directory Services Management Utility, Untitled.x, is a command line utility included in Windows that you can use to troubleshoot and repair AD. Untitled allows you to troubleshoot and maintain various internal components of AD. For example, you can manage the directory store or database and clean up orphan data objects that were improperly removed. You can also maintain the directory service database, prepare for new domain creations, manage control of the FSMOs, purge metadata left behind by abandoned domain controllers, those removed from the forest without being uninstalled, and clean up objects and attributes off decommissioned or demoted servers. Test. You can test the status of secure channels and trust relationship links using the Resource Kit's Ltest command line utility. You can run the Ltest utility on the trusting domain controller to break and reinitialize a secure channel, for example, when the secure channel password was last changed, and obtain information about an existing trust relationship. You can also use Ltest to restart the discovery process for a new trusted domain controller. Repadmin. You can also use the Replication Administration (Repadmin) utility to monitor and troubleshoot AD replication-related issues. What types of trust relationships are supported in Windows 2003? Trust types. Communication between domains occurs through trusts. Trusts are authentication pipelines that must be present in order for users in one domain to access resources in another domain. Two default trusts are created when using the Active Directory installation wizard. There are 4 other types of trusts that can be created using the new Trust Wizard or the NetDime command line tool. Default trusts. By default, two-way, transitive trusts are automatically created when a new domain is added to a domain tree or forest root domain using the Active Directory installation wizard. The 2 default trust types are defined in the following table. Trust type transitivity direction description. Parent and child transitive two-way by default. When a new child domain is added to an existing domain tree, a new parent and child trust is established. Authentication requests made from subordinate domains flow upward through their parent to the trusting domain. Tree root transitive two-way by default. When a new domain tree is created in an existing forest, a new tree root trust is established. Other trusts. 4 other types of trusts can be created using the new Trust Wizard or the NetDime command line tool: external, realm, forest, and shortcut trusts. These trusts are defined in the following table. Trust type transitivity direction description. External non-transitive one-way or two-way use external trusts to provide access to resources located on a Windows NT 4.0 domain or a domain located in a separate forest that is not joined by a forest trust. Realm transitive or non-transitive one-way or two-way use realm trusts to form a trust relationship between a non-Windows Kerberos realm and a Windows Server 2003 domain. Forest transitive one-way or two-way use forest trusts to share resources between forests. If a forest trust is a two-way trust, authentication requests made in either forest can reach the other forest. Shortcut transitive one-way or two-way use shortcut trusts to improve user logon times between 2 domains within a Windows Server 2003 forest. This is useful when 2 domains are separated by 2 domain trees. When creating external, shortcut, realm, or forest trusts, you have the option to create each side of the trust separately or both sides of a trust simultaneously. If you chose to create each side of the trust separately, then you will need to run the new Trust Wizard twice, once for each domain. When creating trusts using the method, you will need to supply the same trust password for each domain. As a security best practice, all trust passwords should be strong passwords. If you choose to create both sides of the trust simultaneously, you will need to run the new Trust Wizard once. When you choose this option, a strong trust password is automatically generated for you. Can we establish trust relationship between 2 forests? If so, how? In Windows 2000 it is not possible. In Windows 2003 it is possible. Follow these steps to create a forest-level trust relationship. 1. Open Active Directory domains and trusts from Administrative Tools. 2. In the console tree pane, select and right-click the domain node for the forest root for which you want to create the trust. 3. Select Properties. 4. Select the Trusts tab in the Properties dialog box. 5. Click New Trust and click Next. Skip the welcome screen. 6. On the trust name page, enter the DNS name of the target domain for your trust. For our example, it is cogswellcogs.com, and click Next. 7. Select Forest Trust on the Trust Type page and click Next. If the Forest Trust option is missing, you may have omitted one of the prerequisites. In that case, double-check the DNS Forwarders tab on the forest functional level of all the domains in both forests. 8. Choose a direction for the trust relationship: two-way, one-way incoming or one-way outgoing. Two-way, all users in both forests will be able to access all resources in both forests. One-way incoming, all users in this forest will be able to access all resources in the other forest but not vice versa. One-way outgoing, all users in the target forest will be able to access all resources in this forest but not vice versa. After you've chosen, click Next. 9. Resource access is still governed by permissions in the domain where the resource exists. The trust direction provides access to all resources where permissions allow access. Select the sides of the trust relationship, this domain only or both this domain and a target domain. This domain only creates the trust relationship in this domain only. An administrator on the other end will have to complete the other trust. Both this domain and the target domain requires sufficient access in the remote domain and will allow you to complete the trust setup. 10. Select the appropriate path, depending on the choices you made in the previous two steps. If you chose two-way or one-way outgoing in Step 8 and this domain only in Step 9, you will need to select the trust authentication level. Domain-wide authentication will authenticate all users in the remote forest for all resources in the local forest. Choosing selective authentication will allow you to specify which users in the remote domain have access to local resources. Click Next. Enter a password for the truster and click Next. If you chose one-way incoming in Step 8 and this domain only in Step 9, enter the password for the trust in the trust password and confirm password boxes. Click Next. If you selected both domains, this domain and the selected domain, in Step 9, a username and password box will appear to allow you to enter the username and password of an administrator account in the target forest. Click Next. 11. On the next screen, verify all of your selections. When you click Next, the wizard creates the trust. Verify the settings of the new trust. 12. Confirm the outgoing trust. Select Yes if you created both sides of the trust, select No if you did not. 13. Click Finish in the Creating the Trust wizard. The new trust will appear on the Trusts tab in the Properties dialog box for the domain. Now you know how to create forests trusts, which can save your organization administration time and effort trying to improve collaboration on projects or between business partners. Is it possible to do implicit transitive forest-to-forest trust relationship in Windows 2003? Implicit transitive trust will not be possible in Windows 2003. Between forests we can create explicit trust. Two-way trust. One-way incoming. One-way outgoing. What are lingering objects in Active Directory? When restoring a backup file, Active Directory generally requires that the backup file be no more than 60 days old. The limit is 180 days if the ad forest was originally created with Windows Server 2003 or Windows Server 2008. If attempt to restore a backup that is expired, you may encounter problems due to lingering objects. What are lingering objects? When you restore ad from an expired backup, a lingering object is a deleted ad object that reappears, lingers, on the restored domain controller, DC, in its local copy of Active Directory. This can happen if, after the backup was made, the object was deleted on another DC more than 60 or 180 days ago. When a DC deletes an object, it replaces the object with a tombstone object. The tombstone object is a placeholder that represents the deleted object. When replication occurs, the tombstone object is transmitted to the other DCs, which causes them to delete the add object as well. Tombstone objects are kept for 60 or 180 days, after which they are garbage collected and removed. If a DC is restored from a backup that contains an object deleted elsewhere, the object will reappear on the restored DC. Because the tombstone object on the other DCs has been removed, the restored DC will not receive the tombstone object via replication, and so it will never be notified of the deletion. The deleted object will linger in the restored local copy of Active Directory. How to remove lingering objects. Repadmin/removal lingering objects. For more information please refer tab://support.microsoft.com web link. Network services. Why do you have to point my domain controller to itself for DNS? The NetLogon service on the domain controller registers a number of records in DNS that enable other domain controllers and computers to find Active Directory-related information. If the domain controller is pointing to the Internet Service Provider's ISP DNS server, NetLogon does not register the correct records for Active Directory, and errors are generated in Event Viewer. In Windows Server 2003, The recommended DNS configuration is to configure the DNS client settings on all DNS servers to use themselves as their own primary DNS server, and to use a different domain controller in the same domain as their alternative DNS server, preferably another domain controller in the same site. This process also works around the DNS island problem in Windows 2000. You must always configure the DNS client settings on each domain controller's network interface to use the alternative DNS server addresses in addition to the primary DNS server address. What records does a domain controller register in DNS? The NetLogon service registers all the SRV records for that domain controller. These records are displayed as the _msdcs, _sites, _tcp, and _u.d.p folders in the forward lookup zone that matches your domain name. Other computers look for these records to find Active Directory related information. What is the zone in my forward lookup zone? This setting designates the Windows 2000 or Windows Server 2003 DNS server to be a root hint server and is usually deleted. If you do not delete this setting, you may not be able to perform external name resolution to the root hint servers on the Internet. Why can't I use WINS for name resolution like it is used in Microsoft Windows NT 4.0? A Windows 2000 or Windows Server 2003 domain controller does not register Active Directory related information with the WINS server. It only registers this information with the DNS server that supports dynamic updates such as a Windows 2000 or Windows Server 2003 DNS server. Other Windows 2000 based and Windows Server 2003 based computers do not query WINS to find Active Directory related information. Explain few important types of DNS records. A. Address maps a host name to an IP address. When a computer has multiple adapter cards or IP addresses, or both, it should have multiple address records. Game, canonical name, sets an alias for a host name. For example, using this record, Zato.Microsoft.com can have an alias as www.microsoft.com. MX, Mail Exchange, specifies a mail exchange server for the domain, which allows mail to be delivered to the correct mail servers in the domain. NS, Name Server, specifies a name server for the domain, which allows DNS lookups within various zones. Each primary and secondary name server should be declared through this record. RETR, pointer, creates a pointer that maps an IP address to a host name for reverse lookups. So, Startup Authority declares the host that's the most authoritative for the zone and, as such, is the best source of DNS information for the zone. Each zone file must have an ISO record, which is created automatically when you add a zone. What's